Hello, our listeners and viewers. In this video, a story for you to listen to as you rest, we will tell the story of one of history's most powerful and fascinating rulers. We will tell the story of Cleopatra. Her proper name was Cleopatra VII. There had been 6 other royal women named Cleopatra in her family before her, but we remember her because she was the last. She was the final monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The word dynasty is simply a term for a ruling family, one that passes power from parent to child. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for 300 years. But they were not Egyptian. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy I, one of the generals who served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered the known world and then died suddenly, his generals tore his empire apart, and Ptolemy seized the richest prize of all, Egypt. For 3 centuries, this Greek-speaking family lived in the glittering capital of Alexandria, separate from the native Egyptian people they ruled. They adopted the title of Pharaoh, but they spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and lived in a world of unimaginable wealth, a city that was the center of all learning and culture in the ancient world. But by the time our Cleopatra was born, in the year 69 BC, that golden age was over. The Ptolemaic dynasty was rotting from the inside. Her family had become infamous not for their wisdom, but for their corruption, their laziness, and their vicious infighting. The history of her family was written in blood. Brothers married sisters, and then murdered them for the throne. Uncles murdered nephews. Mothers poisoned sons. This was the family environment she grew up in. It was a school where the first and only lesson was, trust no one. This internal weakness made Egypt vulnerable. And in the world of 69 BC, vulnerability was a death sentence. The Mediterranean Sea was a shark tank. The old empires were collapsing. A new, terrifying power was on the rise. This power was the Roman Republic. Rome was not like the old kingdoms. It was a systematic, organized, and ruthless predator. It expanded relentlessly, conquering lands and absorbing their wealth. To the Roman senators, the old world was just a collection of assets to be stripped, and Egypt was the single greatest asset on the planet. Why? Because of the Nile. Every year, the Nile River flooded its banks, depositing rich black silt that made the land incredibly fertile. Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. It produced enormous surpluses of grain, feeding not only its own people but the growing hungry population of Rome itself. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply. Beyond grain, Egypt had gold, papyrus, perfumes, and access to the exotic trade routes of Africa and India. It was fabulously, unimaginably wealthy. To Rome, Egypt was a prize waiting to be taken. It was the whale, ancient, rich, and slow. And Rome was the shark, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time Cleopatra was a child, her kingdom was already living on borrowed time. It was technically independent, but in reality, it was what we would today call a client state or a puppet state. Its kings ruled only because Rome allowed them to. The Roman Senate would meddle in Egyptian politics, choosing which brother or sister would rule, always in exchange for massive bribes and political favors. Her father, the ruling pharaoh, was a weak man who had bankrupted the country to pay off his Roman patrons. This is the world Cleopatra was born into. Not a world of romance and poetry, but a world of brutal, high-stakes politics. She was born onto a sinking ship, into a family of traitors, with the greatest military power in history waiting on her doorstep. She inherited a failing kingdom, and she knew from her earliest childhood that she had only 2 choices: be a puppet like her father and watch Rome slowly dismember her country, or fight. It is crucial to understand this harsh reality because the popular image we have of her, the woman of blinding beauty, the seductress who arrived in a carpet, the exotic queen who dissolved a pearl in wine, this image is not history. It is a legend. This legend was a masterpiece of political propaganda, crafted by her mortal enemy, the man who defeated her, Octavian. He would later be known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. To secure his own power, Octavian needed to destroy her reputation. He couldn't just tell the Roman people he had fought another civil war against a fellow Roman, Mark Antony. That was politically dangerous. It was much easier and much more effective to claim he had saved Rome from a dangerous, decadent, foreign queen, a seductive witch from the east who had magically enslaved their noble general. Our story is not about that legend. Our story is about the real woman. She was not beautiful, not in the way her legend claims. The coins minted in her lifetime, which are the only true portraits we have, show a woman with a prominent nose, a sharp chin, and intense, intelligent eyes. She was not a goddess, but she was a genius. She was a ruler, a politician, a commander, a linguist, and a brilliant administrator. She was a mother of 4. She was a naval commander. She was a financial genius who funded armies. And she would use every tool she possessed, her mind, her wealth, her family name, and yes, her charm, to try and save her kingdom. This is the story of her fight, the story of the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra's family was not a normal family. It was a dynasty that had turned inward on itself, defined by suspicion and betrayal, all hidden inside a palace of gold. The city of Alexandria, by contrast, was the jewel of the world. It was a beacon of civilization, home to the great library, the largest collection of knowledge in existence. Scholars, scientists, and philosophers flocked there. But inside the royal palace, there was no enlightenment. There was only a desperate, bloody struggle for a single object, the throne of Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a fatal flaw. They ruled as Greeks, but to legitimize themselves in the eyes of the native Egyptians, they adopted the traditions of the ancient pharaohs. This included the tradition of royal incest. For generations, Ptolemies married their own relatives. Brothers married sisters. Uncles married nieces. This was not seen as taboo. It was seen as a political strategy. It kept the royal bloodline pure, and more importantly, it kept the immense wealth and power of Egypt consolidated within the immediate family. It ensured that no ambitious outsider could marry into the dynasty and claim the throne. But this strategy had a terrible side effect. It concentrated not only power, but also paranoia, ambition, and instability. When the only rivals for your throne are your own siblings, the palace becomes a prison. Every family dinner is a potential plot. Every political advisor is a potential traitor. Cleopatra's ancestors were not great rulers. They were survivors of a brutal family free-for-all. Her recent history was filled with figures of legendary cruelty. One of her ancestors, Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon or Potbelly, was a monster. He came to power by warring against his own brother. He married his brother's widow, his own sister, and then on their wedding day, he murdered her young son, his own nephew, in her arms. He later discarded her to marry her daughter, his own niece. This was the stock she came from. This was not ancient history to Cleopatra. This was the political playbook. The lesson was simple. If you are not strong enough to eliminate your rivals, they will eliminate you. There was no retirement. There was no exile. There was only the throne or the grave. The Alexandria she grew up in was a city of constant conspiracies. The real power often did not lie with the pharaoh himself, but with the shadowy figures in the court. These were the royal tutors, the ambitious generals, and the powerful eunuchs who controlled access to the ruler. They would often pit one royal sibling against another, choosing a child they thought they could manipulate, raising them to the throne, and then ruling through them. If that child became too independent, they would be quietly poisoned, and the cycle would begin again. Cleopatra was one of 5 children. She had 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers. From the moment she could walk, she was a piece in this deadly game. She would have watched as a child how these court advisors flattered her father and plotted behind his back. She would have seen her older sisters scheming, already maneuvering for power. One of her older sisters, Berenice IV, would later successfully rebel against their own father, seize his throne, and rule in his place. This environment forged Cleopatra. She was not raised to be gentle or kind or trusting. She was raised to be a politician. She was raised to be a strategist. She learned to read people. She learned to hide her true intentions. She learned that charm was a weapon, just as effective as a sword. She learned that knowledge was power. If she knew more than her rivals, she could outthink them. While her ancestors had grown lazy, corrupt, and weak, Cleopatra learned from their mistakes. She saw that their cruelty was often pointless, born of panic or stupidity. She would learn to be just as ruthless, but her ruthlessness would be cold, calculated, and purposeful. It would be a tool for survival, not a luxury of power. She was surrounded by family members who were liabilities. She was surrounded by advisors who were assassins in waiting. And she was the monarch of a kingdom that was the richest prize in the world. This background is the key. It explains every single action she would later take. It explains why she would flee, why she would raise an army, why she would gamble everything on an alliance with a Roman general, and why she would, when the time came, be capable of ordering the execution of her own siblings. She was a Ptolemy, and to survive being a Ptolemy, she had to become the most intelligent, the most cunning, and the most ruthless of them all. This lethal family dynamic was one half of the pressure that created her. The other half was the man who ruled them all, her father, a man whose weakness would teach Cleopatra her most important lesson. The man who ruled this dangerous family, and the man who was supposed to rule Egypt, was Cleopatra's father. His name was Ptolemy XII, but history remembers him by his nickname, Auletes, which means the flute player. This was not a compliment. It was a name given to him by his own people in contempt. He was not known as a warrior, a builder, or a statesman. He was known for his decadent parties, his love of wine, and his embarrassing hobby of playing the flute in public, competing in music festivals like a common entertainer. He was, in short, a man who loved the trappings of power, but had no interest in the responsibilities of it. His entire reign was defined by one agonizing problem: legitimacy. He was an illegitimate son, and his claim to the throne was weak. He lived in constant fear of being overthrown, either by his own family or by his subjects. This fear made him paranoid, and that paranoia drove him to seek a powerful protector. He looked to Rome, where Cleopatra would later see Rome as a predator to be managed. Her father saw it as a powerful patron to be bribed. His entire foreign policy was based on one single desperate goal: to have the Roman Senate officially recognize him as the rightful king of Egypt and, crucially, declare him a friend and ally of the Roman people. This title was a political shield, but it came at a staggering cost. Ptolemy Auletes began a campaign of systematic bribery that would cripple his kingdom. He sent rivers of gold, grain, and silver to powerful Roman senators and generals. His most important contact was Julius Caesar. In 59 BC, Caesar was a rising political star in Rome, and he was in enormous personal debt. Ptolemy offered him a fortune, 6,000 talents, an amount so vast it could fund an entire army, in exchange for his support. Caesar took the money. He pushed the decree through the Senate. Ptolemy Auletes got his title, but in the eyes of his own people, he had committed the ultimate sin. He had not only raised taxes to unbearable levels to pay these bribes, but he had publicly sold his kingdom's independence. He was no longer a pharaoh. He was Rome's tax collector. The people of Alexandria were furious. They were a proud, volatile population, and they saw their king as a weak, embarrassing puppet. In 58 BC, when Cleopatra was just 11 years old, the dam of public anger broke. The city exploded into riots. The people of Alexandria stormed the palace, and Ptolemy Auletes was forced to flee for his life. He fled to the one place he could, Rome. This was the ultimate humiliation. A king of Egypt, the heir to Alexander, arriving in Rome not as a visiting monarch, but as a beggar. He spent months groveling before the Senate, pleading with the very politicians he had bribed, begging them to restore him to his throne. He had to take out massive new loans from Roman bankers just to pay for more bribes. Back in Egypt, his oldest daughter, Cleopatra's sister Berenice IV, seized the throne and began to rule as queen. She was popular with the people. She represented a break from her father's disastrous policies. Cleopatra, just a child, watched all of this unfold. She watched her father's weakness lead to his expulsion. She watched her sister easily take his crown. And then, she watched her father's ultimate act of desperation. After 3 years of begging, Ptolemy finally made a deal. He promised the Roman governor of Syria, Aulus Gabinius, the astronomical sum of 10,000 talents to invade his own country. In 55 BC, a Roman army marched on Alexandria. A young, brilliant Roman cavalry officer named Mark Antony served in that campaign and got his first glimpse of the city's wealth. The Roman army crushed the Egyptian forces. Ptolemy, the flute player, was put back on his throne. And what was his first act as restored king? He ordered the execution of his own daughter, Berenice. This was the defining event of Cleopatra's childhood. It was a political education in its rawest form. What lessons did she learn, watching this from the palace shadows? First, she learned that the people, if pushed too far, could be more powerful than a king. Her father had ignored them, and they had cast him out. Second, she learned that your own family, even your own sister, was your most immediate rival and would seize your throne the moment you showed weakness. Third, she learned that Roman friendship was a lie. Rome was not a friend. It was a vendor of services. It sold protection and military force to the highest bidder. Loyalty and treaties meant nothing. Only gold and power mattered. And the final, most important lesson: she learned that weakness was the one unforgivable sin. Her father's weakness had cost him his dignity, forced him to become a puppet, and compelled him to murder his own child to regain his crown. Cleopatra would vow in that moment that she would never be weak. She would never beg. She would never be a puppet. She would be the one holding the strings. When her father died a few years later, in 51 BC, he left his throne to his 2 remaining children, his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra, and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. But he also left them a bankrupt kingdom, a population that despised their family, and, worst of all, a Roman garrison. The very soldiers who had restored him stayed in Alexandria, a permanent reminder of who was truly in charge. He had not left his children a kingdom. He had left them a gilded cage, and the keys were in Rome. The gilded cage her father left her was built in the most extraordinary city in the world, Alexandria. While the royal palace was a place of paranoia and decay, the city itself was the opposite. It was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, the undisputed center of all learning, science, and art. This city was Cleopatra's greatest classroom, and her greatest advantage. Alexandria was home to the Great Library, a place that held, by some estimates, nearly 500,000 scrolls. But it was not just a warehouse for old books. It was part of a larger institution called the Mouseion, or Shrine of the Muses. This was the world's first true research university, a think tank funded by the state. For all their family flaws, Cleopatra's early ancestors had poured fortunes into it. They paid the greatest minds of the known world, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, poets, and philosophers, to live and work there. Eratosthenes, the man who first calculated the circumference of the earth, had been a head librarian there. Euclid, the father of geometry, had taught there. Archimedes, the great inventor, studied there. This was the air Cleopatra breathed as a child. She was not locked away from this world. She was educated by the finest tutors, men who were part of this intellectual elite. But her education was not for leisure. It was a curriculum of power. While her father, Auletes, had infamously studied the flute, Cleopatra studied the hard sciences of governance. She studied rhetoric, the art of public speaking and persuasive argument. This was essential for winning debates, convincing politicians, and commanding the loyalty of a crowd. She studied philosophy not as an abstract theory, but as a guide to ethics and leadership. She studied mathematics and astronomy, which were vital for managing a kingdom's complex economy, its grain distribution, its tax system, and the state-controlled agricultural calendar based on the flooding of the Nile. For generations, her Ptolemaic ancestors had grown lazy. They enjoyed the wealth of Egypt but ignored the intellectual tools available at the Mouseion. They were rulers who could not be bothered to learn. Cleopatra was different. She was intellectually ravenous, restless, and brilliant. She devoured knowledge. She saw the library not as a monument, but as an armory. Every scroll on history, military strategy, or law was a weapon she could use to reclaim her family's power and her kingdom's independence. The city itself was also a teacher. Alexandria was a global melting pot. It was a Greek city designed by Alexander himself, but it had a massive native Egyptian population living alongside the largest Jewish community in the world. Walking through its grand colonnaded streets, one would hear a dozen different languages. This environment taught Cleopatra something her predecessors had failed to learn: cultural flexibility. She understood that to rule this diverse, volatile population, she could not remain a detached Greek queen. She had to be able to connect with all her subjects. This education is what truly separates her from every other Ptolemy. It is the key to her character. When her father was faced with a crisis, he begged and bribed. When her ancestors faced rivals, they resorted to clumsy, brutal murder. Their actions were reactive, born of fear. Cleopatra's education gave her a different set of tools. It gave her strategic depth. It gave her the ability to analyze a complex problem, to plan several moves ahead, and to use her intellect as her primary weapon. It gave her the supreme confidence to one day sit across from men like Julius Caesar, not as a begging puppet queen, the flute player's daughter, but as an intellectual equal. She was a woman who, according to ancient writers, understood finance, logistics, and even medicine, reportedly writing treatises on poisons and cosmetics. And those same writers, even the ones who were hostile to her, all agreed on one remarkable fact: she rarely needed a translator. This skill, her mastery of languages, points to what was perhaps her single greatest political innovation. It was a skill that would connect her to the very soul of her kingdom, a skill that not one of her Greek-speaking ancestors, in 300 years, had ever bothered to learn. The ancient historian Plutarch, writing about a century after her death, was in awe of her voice. He said it was like a multi-stringed instrument, and that she could effortlessly switch from one language to another. He lists the people she could speak to in their native tongues: Ethiopians, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians. She was, in short, a master of the languages of the Eastern Mediterranean. But one language stood out. One language was more important than all the others combined. Cleopatra was the first and only member of her entire dynasty, in 300 years of rule, to learn the Egyptian language. This fact cannot be overstated. It is, perhaps, the most brilliant political move of her entire career, and she made it before she was even 20. For 3 centuries, her family had lived in the Greek-speaking bubble of Alexandria. They viewed the rest of Egypt as a giant farm, a resource to be taxed. They saw the native Egyptian people as their subjects, not their countrymen. When the Ptolemaic kings needed to communicate with the powerful native priesthood, they did so through translators. It was a relationship of cold, distant administration. Cleopatra saw this for what it was, a massive untapped source of power. She understood that Egypt was effectively 2 separate worlds. There was the coastal city of Alexandria, with its Greek politicians, scholars, and merchants. And then there was the rest of Egypt, the ancient timeless world of the Nile Valley, populated by millions of native Egyptians and controlled by a priesthood whose power was older than her entire dynasty. These priests were the true spine of the nation. They controlled vast estates of land, commanding enormous wealth in grain and gold. They ran the great temples, which were not just places of worship, but also centers of industry and learning. And most importantly, they held the hearts and minds of the common people. To the average Egyptian farmer, the political schemes in Alexandria were distant and irrelevant. Their loyalty was to their gods and to the priests who spoke for them. By learning their language, Cleopatra shattered the 300-year-old wall between the palace and the people. She could suddenly bypass her own treacherous Greek court, bypass the layers of translators, and speak directly to these powerful priests. She could read their sacred texts. She could understand their concerns. She showed them a respect that no Ptolemy had ever shown them before. This was not a hobby. It was a calculated strategy. In return for this respect, the Egyptian priesthood gave her something her father could only get from Rome: true legitimacy. They embraced her. They began to actively support her rule, not as a Greek queen, but as a true Egyptian pharaoh. This is when her political branding became a work of genius. Cleopatra began to publicly present herself in the traditional Egyptian style. She left Alexandria and traveled up the Nile to their ancient temples, participating in their sacred rites. She made a direct, powerful connection to the most beloved deity in the Egyptian pantheon, the goddess Isis. Isis was the divine mother, the goddess of magic, wisdom, and protection. She was the ideal of womanhood and power. Cleopatra began to portray herself as the living incarnation of Isis on earth. This was not just dressing up. When she wore the traditional robes of Isis, she was sending a powerful message to the Egyptian people. I am not just your ruler. I am your divine protector. I am the mother of Egypt. This move secured her domestic power base in a way her father, the flute player, could never have imagined. He had spent a fortune to get the title Friend of Rome, a title that made his own people hate him. Cleopatra, by contrast, earned the devotion of her own people. This fanatical loyalty from the native Egyptians would become her greatest asset. It was the insurance policy that her education had given her. It meant that even if the Greek politicians in her own court in Alexandria betrayed her, which they would, she was not just an isolated queen. She was the pharaoh of millions. She was their living goddess. This was her true power. It was not seduction. It was not exotic beauty. It was a formidable intellect, combined with a deep strategic understanding of culture and religion. She had outflanked her entire family history. She had done what no Ptolemy before her had the wisdom or the respect to do. She had become Egyptian. This foundation of internal support was exactly what she needed. Because as her father's reign finally ended, and she and her young brother took the throne, the deadly game she had been training for all her life was about to begin. The traitors inside her own palace were already moving against her. When her father, the flute player, died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was 18 years old. His will, which was filed in Rome to give it the force of Roman law, stated that she would rule Egypt jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was a boy of 10. As was the cold tradition of their family, the two siblings were married. On paper, they were co-rulers. In reality, it was a declaration of war. The young king was a child. He was not the one making decisions. The real power in the Alexandrian palace rested with a trio of ambitious and ruthless court advisors. First was Pothinus, the chief eunuch, who controlled the kingdom's finances. Second was Achilles, the top general of the Egyptian army. And third was Theodotus, the king's personal tutor. This triumvirate of advisors had been running the kingdom during the final feeble years of the flute player. They had grown accustomed to power. The last thing they wanted was a new monarch who would actually rule. The 10-year-old boy was the perfect puppet. They could continue to govern in his name, siphoning the country's wealth and controlling its armies. But the 18-year-old Cleopatra was not a puppet. She was a problem. She was brilliant, she was confident, and she was dangerously popular with the native Egyptian priesthood. She had her own ideas about how the kingdom should be run. From the first day of her reign, she began making decisions without consulting them. She issued decrees, managed the economy, and conducted her own foreign policy. She made it clear that she was the senior pharaoh. Pothinus and Achilles saw their influence, their wealth, and their very lives threatened. They had a simple choice: eliminate Cleopatra or be eliminated by her. They chose to act first. They began a systematic campaign to destroy her. They used the young king, Ptolemy, as their figurehead. They issued edicts that were signed only in his name, deliberately omitting hers. They used their control of the treasury to fund soldiers loyal only to them. And they wielded their most dangerous weapon: the Alexandrian mob. The Greek population of the capital was famously fickle and violent. Pothinus and Achilles spread rumors that Cleopatra was a tyrant, that she cared more for the native Egyptians than for the Greeks of Alexandria. They portrayed her as an arrogant woman who was trying to steal the throne from her innocent younger brother. In 48 BC, after 3 years of this escalating Cold War, the palace turned against her completely. Achilles marched his soldiers into the city, and the mob was incited to hunt her down. Cleopatra, now 21 years old, was forced to flee for her life, smuggled out of the capital. She was declared an enemy of the state. Her brother, the boy king, was now the sole ruler of Egypt, with Pothinus and Achilles holding his strings. This was the moment of her greatest test. And it is here that she proved that she was not her father. Her father, when he was exiled, had groveled. He had fled to Rome, a beggar king, and spent years pleading with senators to restore him. Cleopatra did the opposite. She did not flee west to Rome to beg for help. She fled east to the province of Syria, to the borders of her own kingdom. She was a monarch in exile, but she would not be a beggar. She was a Ptolemy, and her family name still carried immense weight in the eastern Mediterranean. Her dynasty had connections. Her family had vast personal wealth hidden in foreign banks, far from Pothinus's control in Alexandria. Instead of writing letters to senators, Cleopatra began writing contracts for soldiers. She used her wealth and her connections to raise a new army. She hired mercenaries, seasoned veterans from Syria and Arabia. Within months, the 21-year-old queen, who had been cast out and left for dead, was no longer a refugee. She was a general. She was the commander of a credible military force. In late 48 BC, she marched that army back to the borders of Egypt. She encamped near the fortress city of Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. On the other side of the border, her brother's army, led by the general Achilles, dug in to block her return. A full-scale Egyptian civil war had begun. The two armies, one led by a child king controlled by his advisors, the other led by an exiled queen, faced each other in a tense standoff. This was the situation. Two Egyptian armies poised to destroy each other. This would have been the moment the Roman shark had been waiting for. Rome could have used the chaos as an excuse to invade and annex the kingdom. But Rome had its own problems. It was in the middle of its own devastating civil war. And as Cleopatra and her brother's armies stared each other down across the desert sands, a single ship appeared on the horizon. It was a Roman ship, sailing desperately for the Egyptian shore. On board was a defeated Roman general, fleeing for his life. His name was Pompey the Great, and his arrival was about to change everything. The man on that ship, Pompey the Great, was one of the two most powerful men in the world. For the past year, he had been locked in a brutal civil war against his great rival Julius Caesar, for total control of the Roman Republic. Pompey had once been Rome's greatest general. He had also been the official patron of Cleopatra's father, the flute player. It was Pompey who had supported his interests in the Senate. Now, having just suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, Pompey was fleeing for his life. He was sailing to Egypt, the one place on earth he believed he was safe. He was coming to ask the children of his old friend, Ptolemy Auletes, to repay their family's debt and give him sanctuary. His arrival at Pelusium, right in the middle of the two warring Egyptian armies, threw the court of the young king Ptolemy into a panic. The king's advisors, Pothinus the eunuch, Achillas the general, and Theodotus the tutor, were now faced with a decision that would determine the fate of their kingdom. A defeated Roman general was on their shore, but the victor, Julius Caesar, was in hot pursuit right behind him. If they gave Pompey sanctuary, they would make a mortal enemy of Caesar, who was now the undisputed master of Rome. If they turned Pompey away, they would anger the powerful conservative faction in the Roman Senate that still supported him. They were trapped. So they chose a third option, a cold, brutal, and foolishly clever option. Theodotus, the tutor, is said to have argued that if they welcomed Pompey, they would offend Caesar. If they turned him away, they would offend Pompey, who might one day return to power. But if they killed him, they would do Caesar a great service, and a dead man, as he famously said, does not bite. They decided to commit murder. They sent a small boat to Pompey's flagship, welcoming him ashore. Pompey, recognizing one of his former Roman soldiers in the boat, felt safe. He was rowed to the beach, and as he stepped onto the sand, the assassins drew their daggers and stabbed him to death. They cut off his head and pulled his signet ring from his finger, leaving his body on the beach. It was September 28, 48 BC. The court of Ptolemy XIII had made its gamble. They believed they had decisively ended the Roman civil war and earned the eternal gratitude of Julius Caesar. Just 4 days later, Caesar's own fleet arrived in the harbor of Alexandria. He did not come with an invasion force. He came with a small, elite bodyguard of ships and men. He was a battle-hardened general, 52 years old, and he was there for one reason: to capture his rival and end the war. Caesar marched into the city and immediately occupied the royal palace, raising the Roman standard. He declared that as the official representative of the Roman Republic, and as the executor of Cleopatra's father's will, he would settle the dispute between the king and his sister. He summoned the young Ptolemy XIII to his presence. The king and his advisors, Pothinus and Theodotus, arrived at the palace, triumphant. They had prepared the ultimate gift for the Roman conqueror. They presented Caesar with a basket. Inside was the severed, pickled head of Pompey the Great. They had miscalculated. Horribly. Caesar did not react with joy. He reacted with fury and disgust. The ancient writers say he wept. This was not a sentimental gesture. Caesar was outraged for political and personal reasons. Pompey was not just his enemy. He was a Roman consul, the former husband of Caesar's own deceased daughter Julia. It was a monstrous offense for a group of foreign servants to murder one of Rome's most celebrated citizens. But more importantly, It told Caesar everything he needed to know about these men. It showed him they were treacherous, cowardly, and stupid. They were bloody-handed fools who thought this barbaric act would impress him. He now knew he could not trust them. In that moment of revulsion, Caesar made his decision. He would not leave Egypt. He would stay in Alexandria, barricade himself in the palace, and he would enforce his will. He would take control of the situation. He sent messengers commanding both King Ptolemy and his sister, Queen Cleopatra, to disband their armies and come to him in Alexandria to plead their cases. For Pothinus and the king, this was a disaster. Caesar was not leaving. For Cleopatra, exiled on the border, this was the moment. This was the one-in-a-million chance her education, her intellect, and her audacity had been preparing her for. Her brother held the city. His armies were camped outside the palace. Her advisors were traitors who wanted her dead. She was an enemy of the state, and Caesar was locked inside the royal quarter. It was impossible to get to him. Any attempt to enter the city would mean her capture and immediate execution. She needed a way to bypass her brother's army, his guards, and his spies, and to get into one single specific room, a room where Julius Caesar sat. The gamble she took next would become the most famous story of her life. The problem facing Cleopatra was almost impossible to solve. The city of Alexandria was locked down. The general Achilles, loyal to her brother, controlled the streets with thousands of soldiers. The harbors were patrolled by his ships. Every gate to the palace quarter was guarded by men who had orders to kill her on sight. She could not fight her way in. Her army was stuck at the border. She could not send an ambassador. Pothinus would have them executed. She had to get to Caesar herself. It was the only way. If she failed, she would lose her kingdom. If she was caught, she would be executed. What she planned next was not a polite entry. It was an act of infiltration, a high-stakes espionage mission that would have been suicidal for anyone less daring. She could not approach by land. So she came by sea. Under the cover of total darkness, Cleopatra and a single loyal attendant sailed a tiny, inconspicuous fishing boat into the great harbor. This man was Apollodorus the Sicilian, and her life was entirely in his hands. They navigated the dark water, avoiding the patrol boats of Achilles' navy, and managed to land on the shore directly beneath the walls of the royal palace, which was now Caesar's fortress. She had bypassed the city. Now she had to bypass the guards. This is where the most famous part of her legend was born. The popular story, made famous by Shakespeare, says she was rolled up in a fine Persian carpet. The reality is likely something far more practical and even more daring. The ancient writer Plutarch, who gives us the most detailed account, uses a Greek word, stromatodes. This does not mean a fine carpet. It means a bedroll, a laundry sack, or a simple heavy-duty bag used for storing bedding. This makes far more sense. A common fishing boat arriving with a priceless Persian rug would have been immediately suspicious. But a simple servant carrying a lumpy bedroll? It was the perfect disguise. At the sea gate of the palace, Apollodorus, a tall, strong man, is said to have tied this sack up, slung it over his shoulder, and simply walked past the guards. The Roman sentries and any of her brother's spies would have been looking for a queen in royal robes, perhaps with her own bodyguards. They would not have looked twice at a servant, likely grumbling, carrying what appeared to be bedding for one of Caesar's officers. He carried his queen through the courtyards and corridors of her own palace, now an enemy stronghold. He bluffed his way past the Roman sentries guarding Caesar's private quarters, claiming he had a delivery for the general. Finally, he was granted entry. We must imagine the scene. Julius Caesar, the 52-year-old master of the world, a man hardened by decades of war, sits in his room, pondering how to solve this Egyptian crisis. A common servant enters, drops a dirty sack at his feet, and unties the rope. The bag falls open, and from it emerges the 21-year-old queen of Egypt. She was likely disheveled, covered in dust, but very much alive and very much a queen. This moment changed history, and we must be very clear about why. Caesar was not a sentimental fool, easily swayed by a pretty face. The story that he was instantly bewitched by her beauty is Roman propaganda, written later to make him look weak and her look like a sorceress. Caesar was, above all, a supreme judge of character. He was a man who respected, more than anything, audacity. He was a man who had famously crossed the Rubicon, a single illegal act that launched a civil war. He was a man who had conquered all of Gaul against impossible odds. He was a man who respected a high-stakes gamble. In this young woman, he saw a reflection of himself. He saw a leader who was not her weak, groveling father. He saw someone who, when faced with an impossible situation, did not surrender. She did not beg. She assessed the odds, took the 1-in-a-million chance, and had herself smuggled through an enemy army in a laundry bag to plead her case. He was electrified by her daring. In that single brilliant move, Cleopatra had completely outmaneuvered her brother and his entire court. Pothinus, Achilles, and the boy king were all on the outside of the palace, waiting for an audience, their bloody gift of Pompey's head having failed. Cleopatra was on the inside. She had bypassed the gatekeepers and was now alone, face to face with the only man whose opinion mattered. She now had the chance to speak, to use the education, the rhetoric, and the intelligence she had spent her entire life perfecting. This was not a seduction. This was a masterclass in political maneuvering. She had just proven to Caesar that she was the only ruler in Egypt worth talking to. And as the sun rose over Alexandria, her enemies were about to discover that the queen they had exiled was now in the very center of power. The next morning, the trap was sprung. Julius Caesar, now fully understanding the political landscape, summoned the 10-year-old King Ptolemy XIII to the palace. The boy arrived, accompanied by his chief advisor, Pothinus. They walked into the audience hall expecting to negotiate with Caesar one-on-one. Instead, they found Cleopatra. She was no longer a fugitive. She was seated next to the Roman general, very much the queen. In that moment, Pothinus and the king knew they had been completely outmaneuvered. The rage was immediate. The young king reportedly flew into a screaming fit, running into the streets and shouting to the public that he had been betrayed. Pothinus, the cold, calculating advisor, knew his life was now worthless unless he acted. Caesar, attempting to be the calm statesman, publicly read the will of Cleopatra's father. He declared that, as Rome was the executor of this will, his decision was final. Cleopatra and her brother would rule Egypt together, as the will intended. To Pothinus, this was a death sentence. He knew that in any joint rule, the brilliant 21-year-old Cleopatra would dominate her 10-year-old brother. His own power would evaporate. He made his final, fatal decision. He sent a secret message from inside the palace to the general Achilles, who was waiting outside the city with his 20,000-man army. The message was simple: attack. Attack the city, kill Caesar, and kill Cleopatra. Achilles marched his massive battle-hardened army into the streets of Alexandria. The Alexandrian War had begun. This was one of the most desperate fights of Julius Caesar's entire life. He was not in an open field. He was trapped in a hostile city. He had only 4,000 soldiers, his small bodyguard. He was facing an army 5 times that size, which was supported by an enraged local populace. He and his men were barricaded inside the royal palace quarter, a small section of the city against the sea. With him, trapped in this siege, was Cleopatra. This is where their relationship was truly forged. It was not a romance. It was an alliance, born in a desperate struggle for survival. For months they were under constant attack. Cleopatra was not a passive prize, waiting to be rescued. She was Caesar's most valuable ally. He was a foreign general, trapped in a labyrinth he did not understand. She knew the palace. She knew its secret passages, its weaknesses, and its supply routes. She was his chief intelligence officer. She also provided his political cover. Without her, Caesar was just a Roman invader, a violator of Egyptian sovereignty. But with her, he was the legitimate executor of the late king's will, defending the rightful queen of Egypt against a band of traitors. She gave his fight a legal and moral justification. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Achilles' army attacked by land, while the Egyptian navy, still loyal to the king, attempted to blockade the harbor and cut off Caesar's escape. This led to one of the most famous and tragic events of the war. Caesar, a master of the surprise counterattack, knew he had to destroy the Egyptian navy before it could trap him. He ordered his men to set fire to the ships in the harbor. It was a brilliant, necessary military move. But the fire soon spiraled out of control. The flames leaped from the docks to the waterfront buildings, and from there, they spread to the warehouses near the harbor. Tragically, some of these buildings were part of or connected to the Great Library. The fire raged. By the time it was put out, a vast collection of the world's knowledge had turned to ash. It was a devastating cultural loss, an accidental casualty of a war for survival. The war dragged on. Caesar and Cleopatra were under siege, fighting street by street. Inside the palace, the remaining traitors were rooted out. Pothinus, the eunuch who had started the war, was discovered trying to send messages to Achilles. Caesar had him summarily executed. Then, the Ptolemaic family drama took another turn. Cleopatra's ambitious younger sister Arsinoe, who was also trapped in the palace, saw her own opportunity. She managed to escape the Roman lines, defected to Achilles' army, and promptly had herself declared the new queen of Egypt. She then had the general Achilles murdered and took command of the army herself. Caesar and Cleopatra were now fighting an army led by Cleopatra's own sister. The siege was relentless. But Caesar was the greatest general of his age, and Cleopatra was a steadfast ally. They held their ground, waiting for the one thing that could save them: Roman reinforcements. After months of desperate fighting, a Roman relief army finally arrived by land, and the war for Alexandria was over. The combined forces of Caesar and Cleopatra crushed the Egyptian army. In the final chaotic battle, Cleopatra's young brother, King Ptolemy XIII, tried to flee the battlefield. He boarded a boat on the Nile, but it was swamped with too many fugitives. The boat capsized, and the young king, weighed down by his golden armor, drowned in the mud of the river. He was 13 years old. The war was over. The traitors were dead. Her brother was dead. Thanks to her alliance with Caesar, Cleopatra was now the undisputed sole ruler of Egypt. The war was over. The city was quiet. Cleopatra's rivals were dead. But Julius Caesar had a problem. He had won, but now he had to secure the prize. He could not simply declare Egypt a Roman province. Annexing the kingdom outright was politically explosive. It was too rich, too powerful, and placing a Roman governor in charge of Rome's grain supply would give that one man too much power. The Roman Senate would never stand for it. Caesar needed what Rome always preferred: a strong, stable, and above all loyal client ruler. He needed a puppet, but a puppet who was smart enough to keep the country running. He had one. Cleopatra had proven herself to be a brilliant, daring, and reliable ally. But she was also a 21-year-old woman, alone on a throne that her family had spent generations fighting over. To satisfy the demands of Ptolemaic tradition, and perhaps to install a new, built-in check on her power, Caesar insisted that she marry her last remaining brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was a boy of 11. It was a marriage in name only. The boy king would be a silent co-ruler, a living piece of political theater. The real power now rested with Cleopatra, and with the Roman legions Caesar planned to leave behind. With the political situation settled, Caesar did something remarkable. He did not immediately leave. He was the master of the world, with other wars still raging, but he stayed. He and Cleopatra embarked on a famous leisurely journey up the Nile. This was not a romantic holiday. It was a calculated political victory lap. They traveled in a magnificent royal barge, a floating palace, accompanied by a flotille of 400 other ships, carrying a significant portion of Caesar's army. This journey had two purposes. For Caesar, it was a show of force. He was projecting his power deep into the heart of Egypt. He was showing the ancient powerful priesthoods in the great temple cities of Thebes, Dendra, and Luxor that he was the new power behind the throne, and that their queen ruled with his blessing. For Cleopatra, it was a triumphal return. She was touring her kingdom not as a desperate fugitive, but as the undisputed pharaoh. And she was doing it alongside the most powerful man on earth. She, the monarch who spoke their language and worshipped their gods, was now visibly backed by the military might of Rome. It was the ultimate consolidation of her power. This journey, which lasted for weeks, was also when their alliance became a personal one. By the time Caesar finally prepared to leave Egypt, Cleopatra was pregnant. Caesar departed in 47 BC, nearly a year after he had first arrived. He had other wars to fight, other rivals to crush. He left Cleopatra securely on her throne. And just to be sure, he left 3 Roman legions, thousands of his best soldiers, stationed in Alexandria. They were officially there to protect the queen, but everyone, including Cleopatra, understood their second purpose: to protect Rome's grain supply, and to ensure the queen never forgot who her patron was. Shortly after Caesar left, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. This child was her masterstroke. This was the true prize of their alliance. She gave him the audacious name Ptolemy Caesar. The people of Alexandria, with their sharp, cynical wit, immediately gave him a nickname, Caesarion, or Little Caesar. This child was not just an heir. He was a dynastic revolution. He was the living, breathing fusion of the 2 most powerful bloodlines in the world. In his veins ran the blood of the Greek pharaohs, the heirs of Alexander the Great. And in his veins ran the blood of Julius Caesar, the man who was now the unofficial founder of a new Roman dynasty. Cleopatra was no longer just a client queen, a temporary ally. She was the mother of Caesar's only son. She had done what no one else had ever managed. She had bound Egypt and Rome together, not with a treaty, which could be broken, but with blood. In her mind, she had just created the heir to a new combined empire that could one day rule the entire known world. With her son, Caesarion, in her arms, Cleopatra was at the peak of her domestic power. She was a pharaoh, a living goddess, and the mother of the son of the most powerful man in the world. Meanwhile, that man, Julius Caesar, was busy mopping up the last of his enemies in North Africa and Spain. By 46 BC, his civil war was finally over. He returned to Rome not just as a general, but as the undisputed absolute master of the Republic, soon to be declared dictator for life. Once he was secure, he summoned her. In 46 BC, Cleopatra arrived in Rome. This was not a state visit. It was a deeply controversial political event. She traveled with her entire royal court, her 13-year-old boy husband Ptolemy XIV, and most importantly, her infant son, Caesarion. Caesar had to be careful. It was illegal and deeply offensive for a foreign monarch to enter the sacred city limits of Rome with their royal insignia. So he housed her, not in the city itself, but in one of his magnificent private villas, set in vast gardens outside the city, across the Tiber River. But this gesture of caution fooled no one. The visit was a scandal that electrified and disgusted the Roman aristocracy. First, Caesar was already married to a noble Roman woman named Calpurnia. By lodging his foreign mistress and their illegitimate child in such obvious luxury, he was flaunting his disdain for traditional Roman morality. The Roman elite were conservative. They valued family, duty, and public modesty. Caesar was behaving like an Eastern king, not a Roman first citizen. Second, the Romans, to their very core, hated the idea of monarchy. Their republic had been founded centuries earlier by overthrowing a tyrannical king. The very word rex, or king, was a curse. Now, here was Caesar, acting more like a king every day. And here, in his private villa, was a literal queen. And not just any queen, an Egyptian one, the symbol of the very decadent, opulent royal world they despised. Cleopatra did not help matters. She was not a humble guest. She was the queen of Egypt, the heir of Alexander, and in her own eyes a living goddess. She carried herself with an arrogance that the Romans found intolerable. The great orator Cicero, who met her during this visit, wrote about her in his letters with absolute contempt, calling her the queen and complaining of her insolent attitude. Cleopatra's strategic goal for this visit was singular: recognition for her son. She was pushing Caesar to publicly acknowledge Caesarion as his child, and perhaps even name him as an heir. But Caesar, for all his power, was not stupid. He knew that naming a half-Egyptian illegitimate son as his heir would be political suicide. He never officially recognized the boy. But he did something else, something almost as shocking. In the center of Rome, Caesar had just built a magnificent new forum, and in its center, a temple to the goddess Venus Genetrix. Venus the Mother, whom Caesar claimed as his own divine ancestor. In this sacred Roman temple, alongside the cult statue of the goddess, Caesar placed a beautiful solid gold statue of Cleopatra. This was an act of breathtaking arrogance. It was a sacrilege. He was placing his foreign mistress, who styled herself as the living goddess Isis, inside the shrine of his own Roman ancestor. To the Senate, this was the ultimate proof. Caesar no longer saw himself as a Roman. He saw himself as a god-king, just like the Ptolemies. And Cleopatra was his divine consort. This visit, which lasted nearly 2 years, crystallized the fears of the Roman Senate. It was the visual evidence for everything the conspirators, men like Brutus and Cassius, were whispering. Caesar planned to abolish the Republic. He planned to move the capital, perhaps to Alexandria. He planned to become a king, and this Egyptian woman would be his queen. Cleopatra, by pushing her own agenda, by being in Rome, had become a living, breathing symbol of Caesar's tyranny. She, who had come to secure her son's future, had inadvertently become one of the primary justifications for her protector's murder. She was still in her villa in Rome on the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March. On that day, a group of senators, proclaiming they were liberators, cornered Julius Caesar at a Senate meeting and stabbed him to death at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. For Cleopatra, the world had just ended for a second time. Her greatest protector, the father of her child, the man who was the sole guarantor of her kingdom's safety, was dead, and she was now trapped in the city of his assassins. The death of Julius Caesar plunged Rome into absolute chaos. The assassins, the liberators led by Brutus and Cassius, ran through the streets, proclaiming that tyranny was dead. But they had made a fatal error in their planning. They had killed the tyrant, but they had no plan for what came next. They had not killed Caesar's powerful allies, chief among them his co-consul, Mark Antony, and his general, Lepidus. The city became a powder keg. The Senate was in gridlock, the people were rioting, and new armies were being raised. Rome was on the brink of another, even more terrible civil war. For Cleopatra, still in her villa outside the city, this was the most dangerous moment of her life. She was no longer the guest of a powerful dictator. She was now the foreign queen, the symbol of the very tyranny the assassins had fought to destroy. She was a living, breathing target. But more importantly, she was the mother of Caesarion, Caesar's only son. The assassins, who valued the restoration of the Republic, might see her and her son as a lingering monarchical threat that needed to be eliminated. But she was equally in danger from Caesar's own party. Caesar's will had just been read, and it contained a shocking surprise. He had not named Caesarion as his heir. He had posthumously adopted his 18-year-old grandnephew, a sickly but intensely ambitious teenager named Octavian. Suddenly, Caesarion was not the only heir. He was the rival heir. He was a direct threat to this new, official successor Octavian. Cleopatra was trapped between two warring factions, both of whom had a very good reason to want her and her son dead. She did not wait to see how the chaos would settle. She did what she always did when faced with a crisis. She acted. This was not a formal, royal departure. It was an escape. In the confusion that gripped the city, Cleopatra, her young son, her 14-year-old brother-husband Ptolemy XIV, and her entire court gathered their most valuable possessions and fled. They made their way to their ships at the port of Ostia and set sail for the one safe place on earth, Egypt. In the summer of 44 BC, she arrived back in Alexandria. She was, for the first time in her adult life, truly alone on the world stage. Her protector was gone. The entire power structure of the Mediterranean had been shattered. She immediately sealed off her kingdom. She controlled the vital grain supply, and she knew that whatever faction won the new Roman civil war, they would eventually come to her, because they would need her food and her money. From the safety of her palace, Cleopatra watched as Rome began to tear itself apart. The assassins, Brutus and Cassius, fled to the east, to Greece and Syria, to raise their own armies. Back in Rome, Caesar's heirs, Mark Antony and the young Octavian, formed an uneasy and temporary alliance, along with Lepidus. They called themselves the Second Triumvirate, a three-man dictatorship, and their first act was to hunt down the assassins. This new war was a blessing for Cleopatra. It was a breathing space. Rome was too busy fighting itself to worry about her. This vacuum of power gave her a crucial window of opportunity. She was independent in a way she had never been before. But her time in Rome and her own family's bloody history had taught her a vital lesson. You are never truly safe if you have a rival. And as she looked at her domestic situation, she saw one last lingering weakness. She was still, technically, a co-ruler. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, was now a teenager. He was no longer a child. He was old enough to be ambitious. And more dangerously, he was old enough to be used as a pawn by her enemies in Alexandria, or even by one of the new factions in Rome. She, her father, and her older sister had all shown what happens when one Ptolemaic sibling senses weakness in another. Cleopatra had a son, Caesarion, whom she intended to be her sole heir. Her brother was now simply in the way. Cleopatra was back in her fortress. The Roman world was on fire, but for the moment, the flames were far away. Her first priority was to ensure her own palace was fireproof. Her co-ruler, her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, was no longer a child. He was now 15 years old. He was becoming a man. And in the Ptolemaic court, a teenage male co-ruler was not family. He was a rival. Cleopatra had learned this lesson from her father. She had learned it from her older sister, Berenice. And she had learned it from her other brother, Ptolemy XIII, who had drowned trying to kill her. Her time in Rome, observing its brutal power politics, had only reinforced this ironclad rule. Any potential rival, no matter how weak, will eventually be used against you. Her brother was a blank slate. He had no power of his own, but he was a perfect pawn. Her domestic enemies in the Alexandrian court, who despised her for her pro-Egyptian policies, could rally around him. More dangerously, one of the Roman factions could recognize him as the true king of Egypt, just to destabilize her. Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins, was now in the nearby province of Syria, actively raising an army and seeking allies. A pliable teenage king would be the perfect tool for him. Cleopatra would not allow that. She had not survived assassins in Rome only to be undone by a boy in her own palace. She had a son, Caesarion, and she would have only one heir. Then, in 44 BC, shortly after their return from Rome, the 15-year-old king suddenly died. The historical record is silent on the exact cause. There was no investigation. There was no period of state mourning. He simply disappeared. But ancient historians, writing later, all assumed one thing: she had him poisoned. If she did, it was not an act of rage or passion, as her ancestors might have committed. It was a cold, political calculation. It was a preemptive strike. It was the final bloody lesson of her Ptolemaic education, a move to eliminate the last domestic threat to her rule. She was cleaning the board, securing her kingdom before the Roman storm broke. With her brother gone, Cleopatra moved with lightning speed. She could not, as a woman, rule alone. Tradition, and her own political branding, demanded a male co-ruler. She now had the perfect one. She went to the great temples and had her 3-year-old son Ptolemy Caesar crowned as her new co-pharaoh. He would be officially known as Ptolemy the 15th Caesar. He was the perfect partner, an heir who could not challenge her, a child who secured her dynasty, and a living symbol of her connection to Rome. To the native Egyptian priesthood, she presented him as Horus, the divine child of the goddess Isis, who was, of course, herself. To the Greeks and Romans, he was Caesarion, the son of the deified Julius Caesar. It was a masterful piece of political theater. She was now, at 25 years old, in complete and total control of the richest kingdom on earth. She had no husband, no brother, and no advisor who could defy her. She answered to no one. But this independence was a fragile illusion. As she was securing her throne, the Roman civil war was spilling into the east. Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins, had seized control of Greece and Syria. They began sending Cleopatra demands. They needed money, ships, and supplies for their war against Caesar's heirs. At the same time, Mark Antony and the young Octavian, who were hunting the assassins, also sent her demands. They were Caesar's avengers. They were her allies. They, too, needed money, ships, and her grain to feed their armies. Cleopatra was trapped. Both sides were demanding her loyalty. If she supported the assassins, she would be a traitor to Caesar's memory. If she supported Antony and Octavian, she would make a mortal enemy of Cassius, whose armies were right next door in Syria. If she did nothing, both sides would see her as a disloyal coward, a prize to be punished and plundered after their war was over. This was the most dangerous diplomatic game of her life. She stalled. She played for time. She sent what little aid she could to Caesar's allies, while claiming storms and plagues prevented her from sending more. She was walking a tightrope. In 42 BC, at the Battle of Philippi in Greece, the war came to its bloody conclusion. The armies of Antony and Octavian crushed the last of the assassins. Brutus and Cassius were dead. The triumvirate had won. The Roman world was now theirs to divide. And Cleopatra had a new set of masters. Octavian, Caesar's official heir, returned to Italy to rule the West. The man who took control of the East, the man who was now the de facto ruler of her entire world, was Caesar's most loyal and most brilliant general. His name was Mark Antony, and he wanted to know very clearly on which side she had truly been. The Roman civil war was over, and the master of the East was a man named Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony. He was now the most powerful man in Cleopatra's world, and he was nothing like Julius Caesar. Caesar had been a cold, calculating intellectual. He was an aristocrat by birth, disciplined and precise. Mark Antony was his opposite in almost every way. Antony was a man of legendary appetites. He was a soldier's soldier, beloved by the common legionaries. He would drink with them, brawl with them, and fight alongside them in the front lines. He was charismatic, handsome, and famously impulsive. Where Caesar calculated, Antony felt. He was a man of great passions, known for his love of wine, gambling, and women. He was generous to a fault, but also possessed a volcanic temper. He was a brilliant general, Caesar's most trusted commander, but he was not a long-term planner. He lived entirely in the present moment. This was the man who now controlled all the lands from Greece to the border of India. And for Cleopatra, there was a crucial piece of history. She had met him before. Or at the very least, he had been in her city. Years earlier, in 55 BC, Antony was the daring young cavalry officer who had served under the Roman general Gabinius. He was part of the army that had invaded Egypt to restore her father, the flute player, to his throne, and had executed her sister Berenice. Antony had seen Alexandria. He had personally witnessed the staggering, unimaginable wealth of the Ptolemaic court. He had never forgotten it. Now, in 41 BC, Antony was back in the east, and he had a very large problem. During the division of the world, Octavian had taken the difficult, but prestigious task of settling veterans in Italy. Antony had taken the east, which seemed richer, but it came with an enormous military obligation. He was now expected to do what Caesar had been planning to do before he was killed: invade the Parthian Empire. Parthia, a vast kingdom in the lands of modern-day Iran and Iraq, was the only power on earth that had truly humiliated Rome. Years earlier, they had annihilated a Roman army at the Battle of Carrhae, famously capturing their golden eagle standards. This was a stain on Rome's honor that had to be avenged. Antony, as the new master of the East, was now tasked with this invasion. It would be the largest, most expensive military campaign in Roman history. He needed to raise, equip, and supply an army of over 100,000 men. To do this, he needed two things: absolute loyalty from the client kings of the East and money. A lot of money. And Mark Antony knew exactly who had the most. As he toured his new provinces, he began to systematically find the cities and kingdoms that had supported Brutus and Cassius. He was refilling his war chest. But the biggest question mark of all was Egypt. Egypt had remained technically neutral, but Antony's spies and the captured records of the assassins told a confusing story. They suggested that Cleopatra had, at one point, sent some token aid ships and money to the assassins. He needed to know, in no uncertain terms, whose side she was on. From the city of Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey, Mark Antony sent a message. It was not a request. It was a summons. The Queen of Egypt was commanded to appear before him, the Roman triumvir, and explain her actions during the late Civil War. This was the moment Cleopatra had been dreading. It was, for her, a terrifying replay of her past. Once again, a Roman warlord was sitting in judgment, demanding she appear and plead her case. It was her father, groveling in Rome, all over again. She knew that if she appeared as a weak, begging client queen, he would treat her as one. He would bleed her kingdom dry, fine her into bankruptcy to pay for his Parthian war, and then perhaps replace her with a more obedient puppet. But she also knew this was not Caesar. This was Antony. She knew his reputation. He was not a cold intellectual who would be impressed by a clever legal argument. He was a man who appreciated grand gestures, a man who loved spectacle, luxury, and above all, confidence. She could not approach him as a defendant. She could not come to him as a subordinate. She had to meet him as an equal. More than that, she had to meet him as a superior. She had to remind him that he was a Roman general, but she was a goddess, a monarch from a line of kings. Antony had summoned her to his dusty military camp in Tarsus. He was the one in a position of power. But Cleopatra was about to show him and the world what true power and true wealth really looked like. She would not just attend his summons. She would transform it into an event of her own making. Mark Antony sat in the public square of Tarsus, on his high platform, waiting to sit in judgment. The city was crowded with his soldiers and the local populace, all gathered to see the conqueror. He had summoned the Queen of Egypt, and he expected her to arrive in the manner of a humbled client monarch, dusty, nervous, and quick to obey. But Cleopatra did not come. The day passed. He sent another summons. Word came back that the queen was on her way, but she was delayed. For several days, she made the most powerful man in the East wait. She was already reversing the power dynamic. She was not a defendant, rushing to her trial. She was a monarch, arriving at her own pace. When she finally arrived, she did not come by road. She came by water, sailing up the river Cydnus, which flowed through the center of Tarsus. And the spectacle she had prepared was designed to overwhelm the senses of a man she knew was susceptible to them. The barge she arrived on was a floating masterpiece, a work of pure theater. The stern was covered in gold. The sails were not white canvas, but a deep royal purple, a color so expensive to produce, it was worth more than its weight in gold. The oars were not wood, but silver, and they beat the water in time to the music of flutes, pipes, and harps. And on the deck, under a canopy woven with gold thread, Cleopatra herself was reclining. But she was not dressed as a queen. She was dressed as the Greek goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite. In Rome, this goddess was known as Venus. This was a calculated, political, and religious statement. Antony famously claimed to be descended from the hero Hercules. It was a core part of his public image. By appearing as Aphrodite, Cleopatra was elevating herself to his level. Hercules was a demigod. Aphrodite was a true Olympian. She was saying, "We are both divine. We are equals." The rest of the scene was just as carefully crafted. Young boys, dressed as Eros, the god of love, stood on either side of her, fanning her. Her handmaidens, renowned for their beauty, were dressed as sea nymphs and graces, and they were the ones steering the rudders and handling the ropes. But the final touch was the smell. The entire barge was burning vast quantities of the most expensive incense and perfumes. The scent was so thick that, according to the historian Plutarch, it wafted from the river and covered the entire city, long before the barge itself was even in sight. The effect was exactly what she had planned. The people of Tarsus, who had gathered in the public square to see Antony, smelled the perfume. They heard the music. And then they saw the golden ship. The crowd abandoned the Roman general. They surged as one to the banks of the river to witness the arrival of the goddess. Mark Antony was left sitting alone on his platform, humiliated. The spectacle had completely upstaged him. The judge had been abandoned, his courtroom emptied. Recognizing he had been outplayed, Antony tried to recover. He sent a messenger, formally inviting the queen to have dinner with him. He was reasserting his authority. Cleopatra's response was a masterstroke of arrogance and power. She sent a message back, refusing. She said it was far more fitting that he should come to her. And besides, she said, she was already preparing a feast for him. Antony, the Roman conqueror, the new master of the East, was now in a bind. He could refuse and look like a petty, sore loser. Or he could accept, and in doing so, publicly admit that she was the one setting the terms. Curious, and likely amused by her sheer audacity, he accepted. That night, Mark Antony walked as her guest onto her barge. He was expecting a dinner. He was not prepared for what he saw. The barge was illuminated by such a vast number of lamps, arranged in complex geometric patterns, that the entire ship seemed tobe on fire. The opulence was overwhelming. The dining couches, the gold plates, the sheer volume of food and wine. It was beyond anything even he, a man of great appetites, had ever witnessed. It was wealth on a scale that made Rome look provincial. This was not a seduction. This was a demonstration of power. She had not come to Tarsus to answer for her crimes. She had come to show him that her kingdom was fabulously, endlessly wealthy. She was showing him that he was just a general, in desperate need of cash for a war. And she was a goddess, a true monarch, who had more money than he could ever imagine. She was not applying for the role of his subject. She was interviewing for the position of his partner. And in one single spectacular evening, she had made herself indispensable. Antony had come to Tarsus to judge a subordinate. He found himself negotiating with a partner. He was a general with the world's largest army, but he was broke. She was a monarch with the world's largest treasury. Their meeting was not a romance. It was the ancient world's biggest business deal. He needed her money, her grain, her shipyards, and her supplies for his great Parthian war. She agreed to become his chief financier and his quartermaster, the person responsible for supplying his entire army. But her support came with a very high and very specific price. Cleopatra, the ultimate strategist, demanded two things in return for her kingdom's total economic commitment. First, she demanded absolute security. She had eliminated her brothers. But her greatest rival, her younger sister Arsinoe, was still alive. This was the sister who had escaped Caesar's palace, joined the Egyptian army, and declared herself queen, fighting against both Caesar and Cleopatra in the Alexandrian War. After her defeat, Arsinoe had been famously paraded in chains in Caesar's Roman triumph, a deep humiliation. But her life had been spared. She was now living in exile, given sanctuary as a priestess in the sacred temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the holiest sites in the ancient world. She was, by all religious laws, untouchable. To Cleopatra, Arsinoe was a loose end. She was the last remaining Ptolemy who could be used by Rome as a pawn, a replacement queen, should Cleopatra fall out of favor. Before she would invest her fortune in Antony, Cleopatra wanted that threat permanently removed. She asked Antony to kill her sister. This was a monstrous request. It was not just an assassination. It was a sacrilege. To kill someone who had been given sanctuary inside a holy temple was an offense against the gods and all civilized custom. Mark Antony was faced with a choice: offend the gods and the traditions of the Roman world, or lose the only person who could fund his war. He chose the money. He dispatched his soldiers. They marched into Ephesus, entered the sacred temple, dragged the Princess Arsinoe from the steps of the altar where she was clinging, and executed her. This act sent a shockwave across the Roman world. It was a public relations disaster for Antony. It showed that he was willing to violate the most sacred laws at the request of his new foreign queen. But for Cleopatra, it was a cold, brutal, and total victory. The Game of Thrones her family had played for centuries was over. She was the last Ptolemy standing. All her siblings were dead. Her throne, and her son Caesarion's inheritance, were finally secure. Second, she demanded land. She wanted to rebuild the Ptolemaic Empire to its former glory. Antony, as the new master of the East, had the power to redraw the map. He agreed. He transferred vast, wealthy territories, including the island of Cyprus, parts of the Syrian coast, and the valuable timber forests of Cilicia, back to Egyptian control. These were not just gifts. They were strategic assets that would enrich her kingdom and provide the raw materials she needed to build his new war fleet. With the deal sealed in blood and land, Antony accepted Cleopatra's invitation to spend the winter of 41 to 40 BC with her in Alexandria. This was not just the decadent party that the Roman propagandists later claimed. Yes, they feasted, they drank, they gambled, and they formed a famous society of inimitable livers, dedicated to a life of pleasure. This lifestyle suited Antony's personality perfectly. But underneath the parties, this was a working summit. Antony was observing firsthand the efficiency and wealth of her kingdom. Cleopatra was integrating his military command with her economic machine. While they feasted at night, by day her shipyards were building his ships, her granaries were earmarking his food, and her treasuries were minting his silver. She was proving to him that she was not just a lover. She was the most competent ally he would ever have. She was his banker, his quartermaster, and his chief strategist in the East. By the time Antony left Alexandria in 40 BC to attend to Roman affairs, their partnership was absolute. He was completely dependent on her for his future military success. And she was pregnant with twins. This, too, was a strategic bond. She was now bearing the children of the new most powerful man in Rome, just as she had borne the son of the last. She was tying her dynasty not just to one Roman leader, but to Rome itself. Antony left Alexandria in the spring of 40 BC. He left a pregnant Cleopatra and sailed back into the turbulent world of Roman politics. He was a triumvir, and his triumvirate was falling apart. His partner in the West, the young, cold, and calculating Octavian, was deeply suspicious of him. Octavian controlled Italy, and he used his power to deny Antony the new legions he had promised him. The two men were on the brink of another civil war. This was the first great test of Antony's loyalties. Was he the new Eastern king, bound to Cleopatra? Or was he a Roman leader? He answered decisively. He was a Roman. His first wife, Fulvia, who had been waging her own war against Octavian in Italy, had conveniently died. This opened the door for a political solution. At the city of Brundisium, the two rivals met. They redivided the Roman world, and to seal this new pact, Antony agreed to a political marriage. He would marry the one person who could guarantee the peace: Octavian's elder sister, Octavia. Octavia was, in every conceivable way, the anti-Cleopatra. She was the most admired woman in Rome, celebrated as the perfect example of Roman virtue. She was modest, loyal, dignified, and famously beautiful. Where Cleopatra was an exotic queen, a living goddess, and a master of political theater, Octavia was a noble Roman matron, devoted to family and state. She was the symbol of everything the Roman aristocracy respected. Antony's marriage to her was a powerful public statement. He was reaffirming his loyalty to Rome, to his partner Octavian, and to traditional Roman values. Back in Alexandria, far from these negotiations, Cleopatra gave birth. She was alone. She had his children, twins, a boy she named Alexander Helios, the sun, and a girl she named Cleopatra Selene, the moon. She was now the mother of 3 children, by 2 different Roman masters. But the father of her newest children was now married to another woman. What followed was the longest, most dangerous silence of Cleopatra's reign. For nearly 4 years, Antony stayed away. He did not return to Egypt. He did not send for her. He did not, as far as the historical record shows, even communicate with her. He settled in Athens, and he lived, quite publicly, as the husband of Octavia. He was, by all accounts, a good husband. They had 2 daughters together. He was governing the eastern provinces, but he was doing it with his Roman wife, as a Roman leader. This period is the single greatest piece of evidence against the propaganda of Octavian. The idea that Antony was instantly and permanently enslaved by a foreign sorceress was a lie. He was a Roman politician, and his marriage to Octavia was a sincere, strategic attempt to make his partnership with Octavian work. For Cleopatra, these must have been agonizing years. She had invested everything in their alliance. She had his children. And he had, in a single political move, replaced her. She was now in a precarious position. She was isolated. She was a 29-year-old queen with 3 small children. Her kingdom was at peace, but she had no protector. Her great partner was now married to the sister of her great rival, Octavian. She could trust no one. She did what she always did. She did not panic. She governed. She focused on her kingdom. She strengthened her economy, she reorganized her military, and she ruled her people, the native Egyptians, as their pharaoh. She raised her son Caesarion to be a king. And she raised her new twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, as the children of a man who might never return. She was waiting. She was watching the fragile alliance between Antony and Octavian, knowing that the ambitions of 2 such men could not coexist for long. The bond sealed by the virtuous Octavia was, in the end, just paper over a chasm of mutual hatred and ambition. Antony, for his part, was growing frustrated. His marriage to Octavia had bought him peace, but it had not solved his fundamental problem. He still needed to invade Parthia, and his partner, his brother-in-law Octavian, was still withholding the legions he had promised. Octavian was deliberately starving him of the resources he needed to win glory in the East. In 37 BC, after 3 years of this failing marriage, Antony realized the truth. Octavia was a wonderful wife, but she was a political chain. His alliance with Octavian was a trap. He would never get what he needed from Rome. He needed an ally who was not his rival. He needed someone who would not withhold resources, but provide them. He needed someone whose success was tied to his success. He needed his banker. He needed his quartermaster. After nearly 4 years of silence, Antony sent a message to Alexandria. He was coming back. When Antony returned to the east, he did not come to Alexandria. He was a general preparing for the most massive war of his life. He established his military headquarters in the great city of Antioch, in Syria, and it was from there, in 37 BC, that he summoned the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra came to him. But this was not the nervous, pleading defendant of Tarsus. This was a queen who had been abandoned for 4 years, who had ruled her kingdom alone, and who was now being asked to return to the table. She came as the indisputable, more powerful partner in the negotiation. Antony's need was desperate. His invasion of Parthia was imminent, and he needed it to be a stunning success. He saw it as the one great victory that would give him the popular support and military glory he needed to finally eclipse his rival Octavian. But he could not do it without her. He needed her gold, her grain, and her supplies, and he needed them immediately. Cleopatra agreed. She would once again be his banker and his quartermaster. But her price, after being cast aside for his Roman wife, was now much higher than just land and security. This time she demanded legitimacy. She demanded that he publicly acknowledge the children he had abandoned. She was now 32 years old, the mother of his twins. She would no longer be his secret partner in the East. She would be his public one. Antony, who had everything to gain and nothing left to lose by defying Octavian, agreed to all of it. He formally and publicly recognized Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene as his legal children. This was a direct political assault on his Roman wife Octavia, and by extension on her brother Octavian. Their partnership was renewed, now stronger and more public than ever. Soon after this reunion in Antioch, Cleopatra conceived their 3rd child, another son who would be named Ptolemy Philadelphus. This was the formal beginning of their shared empire. Antony was the military arm, the Roman triumvir. Cleopatra was the economic and political heart, the Egyptian pharaoh. She returned to Alexandria and opened her treasuries. She equipped his legions, built his siege engines, and sent a vast river of gold and grain to his campaign headquarters. She had fulfilled her part of the bargain, providing him with the best supplied army Rome had ever sent to the east. In 36 BC, Antony marched. He led over 100,000 men, Roman legionaries and allied troops, into the vast hostile territory of the Parthian Empire. It was a catastrophe. Antony was a brilliant battlefield brawler, but he was not a master of logistics and long-term strategy like Caesar. The Parthians were not an army he could meet in a single decisive battle. They were masters of mobile warfare, light cavalry who would strike and then vanish into the desert, drawing his army deeper and deeper into enemy territory. Antony's supply lines, stretching hundreds of miles, were cut. His siege engines, which he had foolishly left behind in a rush, were captured. The brutal Armenian winter set in early. His men began to starve, freezing to death in the mountains. The campaign turned into a desperate, agonizing retreat. For weeks, the legionaries' force marched back to safety, harassed every step of the way by the Parthian horse archers. By the time the broken remnants of his army stumbled back into Roman territory, Antony had lost more than 30,000 men. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. He had gambled everything on this war, and he had lost. He was a broken commander. His reputation was shattered. His army was decimated. And he had proven to the world that, without Caesar, he was a failure. His Roman wife, the loyal Octavia, immediately raised fresh troops and supplies in Rome and set sail to come to his aid, to reinforce him as a good Roman wife should. But Antony was in Antioch humiliated, and he knew what that relief effort really was. It was a gesture from Octavian, a symbol that he, Antony, was now the weak partner, dependent on his rival for survival. He could not accept that. He could not face his virtuous Roman wife as a failure. He made the most fateful decision of his life. He sent a message to Octavia, telling her to stop to send the supplies, but to come no further. And then he sent another message. He sent it to the one person who would not judge him, the one person whose fortune was now the only thing propping him up. He sent a message to Alexandria. He was coming to her not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. This was the moment of no return. He had publicly rejected his Roman wife and his Roman partner. He was turning his back on Rome and choosing, once and for all, his Egyptian queen. Antony returned to Alexandria in 36 BC, a defeated man. He had lost a third of his army. His reputation was in tatters, and he had publicly rejected his Roman wife. He was now completely and utterly dependent on Cleopatra's wealth for his political survival. But Cleopatra did not greet him as a failure. She had a far more brilliant strategy. She greeted him as a conqueror. She understood that to keep this proud, broken man loyal, she had to rebuild his ego, but rebuild it in her world, not Rome's. She encouraged a minor successful campaign he waged in Armenia, and when he returned, she staged a magnificent celebration. It was a triumph, the traditional parade for a victorious Roman general. But it was staged in Alexandria, not Rome. This was a shocking break with tradition. A Roman general was celebrating his victory not for the Roman people, but for an Egyptian queen. This was the prelude to their most audacious act, a grand piece of political theater that would make war with Rome inevitable. In 34 BC, they staged an event that would become infamous as the Donations of Alexandria. In the city's vast public gymnasium, two massive golden thrones were placed on a silver platform. One was for Antony. One was for Cleopatra. Below them, on smaller thrones, sat their three young children. The 6-year-old twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and their 2-year-old son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. And on another throne sat Cleopatra's firstborn, the 13-year-old Caesarion. They appeared not as politicians, but as gods. Antony was dressed as the god Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy. Cleopatra was dressed as her divine patron, the goddess Isis. Before the assembled crowds of Alexandria, Antony stood and began to speak. He declared that Cleopatra was the queen of kings. Then, one by one, he pointed to their children and donated vast swathes of the world to them. To his son, Alexander Helios, he gave the kingdom of Armenia, and audaciously the entire Parthian Empire, the very kingdom he had just failed to conquer. To the boy's twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, he gave Cyrene and Libya. And to his youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, he gave Syria and most of the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. These were, at the time, just words. He was giving away lands he didn't fully control. But it was a stunning declaration. They were carving up the Roman East as their own personal property, to be ruled by their new dynasty. Then came the final explosive announcement. Antony declared that Cleopatra's 13-year-old son, Caesarion, was the true, biological, and rightful son of Julius Caesar. He was, therefore, the true heir to Caesar's legacy, and he was proclaimed King of Kings, a title even higher than his mother's. This was not a political statement. This was a declaration of war. In Rome, the entire power base of Mark Antony's rival Octavian rested on one single sacred fact, that he was the Divi Filius, the son of the deified Caesar. He was Caesar's adopted son, and therefore his legal and political heir. Now, from a golden throne in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony were holding up a 13-year-old boy and telling the entire Roman world, "You follow a fake. You follow an impostor. This is the real blood of Caesar. This is the true heir." The line had been drawn. This was no longer a Roman triumvir and his wealthy eastern ally. This was a rival empire. This was a new dynasty, founded by Antony and Cleopatra, with an heir who had a better claim to Caesar's name than Octavian himself. They had publicly declared that Octavian was illegitimate. They had announced their intention to create a new Hellenistic Roman Empire, ruled from Alexandria, not Rome. Antony had formally divorced his Roman wife Octavia. He had gone native in the eyes of Rome. He had minted coins showing his face on one side and Cleopatra's on the other, an unprecedented act, as a living woman had never been placed on a Roman coin. Cleopatra had finally achieved her dream. She had her partner. She had her empire. And she had her heir, Caesarion, whom she now positioned to one day rule it all. But in Rome, the man she had just declared a fake was a cold, patient, and methodical genius of propaganda. And he had just been given all the ammunition he would ever need. The news of the donations of Alexandria arrived in Rome and detonated like a bomb. It was exactly the weapon Octavian had been waiting for. He was not a great general like Antony, nor a brilliant intellectual like Caesar, but his political instincts were sharper than both. He was a patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless master of propaganda. He understood that he could not declare war on Mark Antony. The Roman people were sick of civil wars, of Romans killing Romans. To attack Antony directly would make Octavian look like the aggressor, another power-hungry warlord. His strategy was brilliant. He would not attack Antony at all. He would convince Rome to attack Cleopatra. He would make this a foreign war, a war of defense, a holy crusade to save Rome from an existential threat. To do this, he had to destroy Cleopatra's reputation and, in the process, sever Antony's last remaining ties to Rome. Octavian launched the first great political smear campaign in Western history. He used his vast wealth to commission pamphlets, poems, and public speeches that all told one simple, terrifying story. The story was this: Mark Antony, their great general, a man of Hercules, was no longer himself. He was a man under a spell, a victim, enslaved by a foreign sorceress. The real enemy, the propaganda insisted, was her, Cleopatra. She was painted as everything the Romans feared and despised. She was not a queen, she was a whore queen. She was not a goddess, she was a witch who used dark magic and exotic poisons. She was not a political partner. She was a decadent Eastern despot, a drunkard who ruled a court of fawning eunuchs. The poets in Octavian's pay wrote of Antony as a fallen hero, a Roman general who now wore Egyptian silks, painted his face, and worshipped animal-headed gods, all at the command of his mistress. The most terrifying rumor, and the one Octavian pushed the hardest, was that Cleopatra had made Antony promise to conquer Rome. The goal, they said, was to move the capital of the entire world from the sacred banks of the Tiber to the decadent, foreign city of Alexandria. She would rule them. She would make the Roman people her slaves. It was a campaign built on xenophobia, sexism, and fear. And it was devastatingly effective. But Octavian needed one final piece of proof. He needed a smoking gun to prove beyond all doubt that Antony was no longer a Roman. He found it in 32 BC, in the most sacred place in Rome. Antony had, years earlier, deposited his official last will and testament with the Vestal Virgins. This was the holiest of trusts. The Vestals were sacrosanct, their temple inviolable. No one could touch that document. Octavian, in a shocking act of sacrilege, marched his soldiers to the temple of Vesta and seized the will by force. The Vestals were powerless to stop him. He then brought this stolen private document before the entire Roman Senate and read it aloud. The contents of the will were exactly what Octavian had hoped for. First, it officially confirmed all the donations of Alexandria, recognizing Caesarion as Caesar's true son. This was a direct public insult to Octavian. Second, it left large legacies and territories to the children he had with Cleopatra. But the third point was the one that destroyed him. The will stated that if Mark Antony should die, even if he died in the city of Rome itself, his body was to be packaged, shipped to Egypt, and buried in Alexandria, side by side with Cleopatra. The Senate was thrown into an uproar. This was the ultimate betrayal. This was the proof. He was no longer a Roman citizen. His heart, his loyalty, and even his body now belonged to a foreign queen. The outrage was total. Octavian had won. He did not ask the Senate to declare Antony an enemy of the state. He didn't have to. Instead, he had the Senate formally strip Antony of all his future powers as triumvir and consul. He was now, legally, a private citizen. And then, with the full unified backing of the Senate and the people of Rome, Octavian declared war. He declared it not on Antony, but on a single foreign enemy, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. The trap was set. It was not a civil war. It was a war of national defense. Antony, forced to choose, now had no choice but to raise his own fleet and army to defend his queen. If he fought, he was a traitor, fighting for a foreign power against his own country. The propaganda was complete. The final war, the one that would decide the fate of the entire known world, was about to begin. The war was on. The fate of the world would be decided not by propaganda, but by force of arms. By 31 BC, both sides had gathered their forces. It was one of the largest displays of military power the world had ever seen. Antony and Cleopatra combined their assets. They had a massive land army of over 100,000 men and a fleet of nearly 500 warships. But the core of their fleet was their weakness. Their ships were giants, called quinquiremes. They were enormous floating fortresses with high decks, designed for boarding. They were powerful, but they were also incredibly heavy and slow. Octavian's fleet was smaller, about 400 ships. But his force was commanded by the single greatest military mind of the age, a man who was not Octavian, but his childhood friend and admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa was a genius of naval warfare. He had designed a new kind of ship, the Liburnian. It was light, fast, and low to the water, designed not for boarding, but for one single deadly purpose: to ram. Antony gathered his massive forces in western Greece, wintering his fleet and his army in the deep, sheltered waters of the Ambracian Gulf, near a place called Actium. This was his first mistake. Agrippa, with his faster, more mobile fleet, immediately blockaded the entrance to the Gulf. He cut Antony off from the sea. Antony's fleet was trapped. Then, Agrippa began seizing all the coastal towns and supply depots in the area. He cut Antony off from the land. Antony's massive army, camped on the marshy, mosquito-infested shores of the Gulf, began to rot. Disease, likely malaria, swept through the camp. Supplies of food and fresh water ran out. The soldiers grew demoralized. They were trapped, starving, and sick. Antony's command structure began to crack. He was a brilliant battlefield general, but a poor long-term strategist, and he was surrounded by Roman officers who were deeply uneasy about the presence of his Egyptian queen. They despised taking orders that originated from her. One by one, high-ranking Roman senators and commanders began to desert, slipping out of the camp at night and defecting to Octavian's side, bringing with them Antony's strategies and secrets. Antony was cornered. His land army was disintegrating. His fleet was useless, trapped in the bay. His only option was to use his massive ships to punch a hole through Agrippa's blockade and escape to the open sea, to regroup and fight another day. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the sea was calm. Antony boarded his flagship. Cleopatra was also with the fleet, commanding her own squadron of 60 Egyptian warships. Crucially, her ships were loaded with the one thing they could not afford to lose: the Egyptian state treasury, the massive war chest that was funding their entire operation. Antony's fleet rode out of the Gulf. Agrippa's lighter, faster ships were waiting for them in battle formation. The clash was a collision of two different philosophies of war. It was, as one historian said, a battle between towers and speed. Antony's massive ships were almost impervious to ramming. Agrippa's ships were like wolves surrounding a herd of elephants. They would dart in, shatter the oars of the giant quinquiremes, crippling them, and then back away, using catapults and fire arrows to rain destruction on the packed decks, avoiding at all costs the grappling hooks from above. The battle raged for hours. It was a chaotic, brutal stalemate. Neither side could gain a clear advantage. Then, around noon, something changed. A steady wind, the one that reliably blew up every afternoon, filled the sails. Suddenly, in the middle of the battle, a squadron of 60 ships at the rear of Antony's line did something inexplicable. They hoisted their sails. In a Roman naval battle, sails were not used for fighting. They were stowed away. Hoisting sails meant only one thing: flight. It was Cleopatra's squadron. Using the new wind, her ships suddenly broke from the battle and sailed south, right through a gap in the fighting, heading for the open sea. The soldiers on both sides watched, stunned. But no one was more stunned than Antony's own men. Then they saw their commander, Mark Antony, the man who claimed to be Hercules, the man who had fought alongside Caesar, do the unthinkable. He abandoned his flagship. He abandoned his men. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship, and with a few of his officers, he set off in pursuit of the fleeing Egyptian queen. The effect on his fleet was catastrophic. Their commander, the man they had followed for decades, had deserted them in the middle of their fight for survival. The chain of command vanished. Morale evaporated. The fleet, leaderless and confused, fought on, but it was now a lost cause. One by one, the ships were outmaneuvered, set on fire, and sunk. By nightfall, most of Antony's fleet was at the bottom of the sea. The rest surrendered. His land army, which had watched this disaster from the shore, held out for a week, unable to believe their general had abandoned them. Then they too surrendered. In a single afternoon, Antony and Cleopatra had lost everything. It was the most total and the most personally humiliating defeat imaginable. And it had all been triggered by that one inexplicable decision: the flight of the queen and the desertion of her general. The Battle of Actium was not just a defeat. It was a psychological collapse. For centuries, historians have debated the central mystery of that day. What happened? Was it an act of pre-planned treachery, or simple, desperate cowardice? One theory suggests the entire battle was a ruse. It was never meant to be a full engagement. It was a planned breakout. Cleopatra's squadron, which held the entire war treasury, was always meant to flee. Her role was to save the money. Antony's role was to use his main fleet to punch a hole for her, and then, supposedly, disengage and follow her with the rest of his ships. If this was the plan, it went horribly wrong. Perhaps the battle was too intense, or perhaps Agrippa's fleet was too fast. The hole never properly opened, and when Cleopatra made her desperate run for it, it looked to everyone else like an act of desertion. The other, simpler theory is that Cleopatra, seeing the battle was hopeless and that Agrippa's ships were slowly winning, simply panicked. She was a monarch, not a soldier. Her instinct was to save herself, her son, and her treasury. She fled. But this does not explain Antony's action. His desertion is what truly defies military logic. He was a Roman general, a man who had lived his entire life by the code of the legions. His men worshipped him, and he abandoned them. The most likely and most human explanation is that in that moment, seeing her ship, and with it his entire fortune, his family, and his last hope, sailing away, he simply broke. He suffered a total emotional collapse, and his impulsive nature took over. He left his honor, his army, and his reputation burning in the sea behind him. The journey back to Egypt was a voyage of shame. The ancient writer Plutarch paints a devastating picture. For 3 days, Antony sat alone at the prow of Cleopatra's flagship. He refused to see her. He refused to speak to anyone. He sat with his head in his hands, a man utterly consumed by the horror of what he had done. He was not a general. He was not Hercules. He was a deserter. Cleopatra was in an equally desperate, but more practical frame of mind. Her fleet was gone. Her army was gone. Her partner was a broken man. She was returning to her capital, a defeated queen, with the victorious Octavian surely on his way to finish her. She knew that the moment the news of Actium reached Alexandria, the city would erupt in riots. They would likely lynch her and surrender to Octavian to save themselves. She had to get back inside her palace before the news broke. And so she devised one last brilliant piece of theater. As her flagship approached the great harbor, she did not fly the tattered flags of a defeated admiral. She ordered the ship to be crowned with garlands of flowers, as if returning from a great victory. She had the musicians play triumphant songs. The people of Alexandria, seeing the royal ship return in celebration, were fooled. They cheered. The port guards let her through. She sailed into her harbor, disembarked, and immediately sealed the palace gates behind her. It was a brilliant ruse. It bought her a few more months. The winter of 31 BC was an agonizing one. The world was now Octavian's. He was busy in Greece and Asia, consolidating his newfound power, methodically taking over Antony's old provinces. He was in no hurry. He knew his enemies were trapped. In Alexandria, the couple waited for the end, and they waited in very different ways. Antony fell into a deep alcoholic depression. He abandoned the palace and built a small house for himself on a pier in the harbor. He called it his Timoneon, named after Timon of Athens, a famous philosopher who had renounced all mankind. He lived there as a hermit, drinking heavily, raging at the friends and allies who were now, one by one, defecting to Octavian. Cleopatra, on the other hand, was a pragmatist to the last. She knew there was no hope of military victory. Her only remaining weapon was her own death and her treasure. She moved herself, her 3 youngest children, and the entirety of the Ptolemaic treasury, a mountain of gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, and ivory, into her mausoleum, a magnificent tomb she had been building for herself near the temple of Isis. It was a fortress. And with the treasure, she also moved vast quantities of combustible materials: flax, wood, and oil. She sent a message to Octavian. She was willing to negotiate. She would abdicate if he would just let her son, Caesarion, rule. But she was also sending a silent secondary message with her fortress tomb. If he refused her terms, she would light a match. She would burn herself, her children, and the entire treasury of Egypt, leaving him nothing to parade in his triumph but ashes. While she waited for his reply, she began her final research. She, who had studied medicine, began methodically testing poisons on condemned prisoners. She was looking, Plutarch says, for the fastest, most painless death, one that did not involve violent convulsions. She was, as always, a planner. She was preparing for her end, and she would control it, just as she had controlled everything else. The long, agonizing winter of waiting finally broke. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian began his final, methodical advance. He did not just attack from one side. He executed a pincer movement. His general, Cornelius Gallus, attacked from the west, having secured the province of Cyrene. Octavian himself, with his main army, marched from the east, through Syria. The gateway to Egypt was the fortress city of Pelusium, the same place where Cleopatra had once camped with her own army. The fortress surrendered to Octavian almost without a fight. This news was a devastating blow to Antony, but it also fed his darkest, most paranoid suspicions. Had the commander of the fortress defected? Or had Cleopatra, in a desperate last-minute gamble, secretly ordered him to surrender? Was she already negotiating her own survival, trying to buy her kingdom by selling him? Octavian's legions arrived at the walls of Alexandria. The sight of the enemy seemed to momentarily shake Antony out of his depressive fog. The old brawler, the man of Hercules, re-emerged for one last desperate fight. He gathered his remaining cavalry and led a ferocious, suicidal charge out of the city gates. He caught Octavian's cavalry by surprise and actually managed to win a small, fierce skirmish, scattering the enemy. He returned to the palace that night triumphant. It was a pathetic, minor victory, but it was a victory. He felt a flash of his old self. He was said to have kissed Cleopatra, telling her she could be proud of his final performance. That night, he prepared his remaining forces, his land army and his fleet in the harbor, for a full-scale battle the next morning, August 1st. As the sun rose, Antony stood on a high point of land, watching his fleet sail out to meet Octavian's fleet. He expected a glorious final clash, but there was no battle. As Antony's ships approached the enemy, his men did not raise their weapons. They raised their oars in a gesture of salute. Then, in perfect formation, the entire Egyptian fleet simply turned and joined Octavian's side, defecting without a single arrow being fired. At the same moment, his land army, seeing the betrayal of the fleet, either surrendered or deserted, melting away into the desert. For Antony, this was the final, undeniable proof. The fleet would not have defected unless it was following orders. His suspicion about Pelusium was correct. Cleopatra had betrayed him. She had made a deal with Octavian to save herself, and the price had been his army, his fleet, and his life. He was now a general with no soldiers, an admiral with no ships. Screaming in pure animalistic rage, Antony ran from the harbor back to the palace, his sword drawn. He was screaming for one person: Cleopatra. He was going to kill her. But the queen had seen the defection from her palace window. She knew his rage, and she knew he would come for her. She, along with her two most loyal serving women, Iras and Charmian, and her vast treasure, fled to her fortress tomb. They sealed the massive stone-reinforced doors from the inside. As Antony burst into the empty palace, raving, her messengers found him. Terrified that he would tear the tomb apart to get to her, Cleopatra had given them a message to deliver, a desperate lie to stop his rage. The message was simple. The queen is dead. She had taken her own life. When Antony heard the news, his rage vanished. It was replaced by a hollow, empty void. His army was gone. His fleet was gone. The world was gone. And now, the woman for whom he had sacrificed all of it was also gone. There was nothing left to live for. He went to his chamber and called his most loyal servant, a man named Eros. He made Eros promise long ago that if the end came, Eros would kill him. That time was now. Antony ordered Eros to draw his sword and strike the fatal blow. Eros, in tears, drew his sword. But he could not kill the man he had served his entire life. He turned the sword, said, "You will see your master go first," and stabbed himself, falling dead at Antony's feet. Antony, filled with a sudden new shame, looked down at his faithful servant. "That was nobly done, Eros," he whispered. "You have shown me what I must do." He took his own heavy Roman sword, placed the hilt on the floor, and fell upon the blade. But he, too, failed. He had missed his heart. The wound was mortal, but it was not fast. He fell to the floor, mortally wounded in excruciating pain, but very much alive. He begged his remaining officers to end his suffering, but they all fled the room, horrified. He lay there, bleeding, when another messenger from Cleopatra arrived. This one told the truth. The queen was not dead. She was alive, barricaded in her mausoleum. Hearing she was alive, Antony found one last reserve of strength. He had one final wish, to die in her arms. He begged his guards to carry him. They lifted his broken, bleeding body and carried him through the streets to the base of her tomb. When he arrived, the massive doors remained sealed. Cleopatra could not open them. Octavian's soldiers were already beginning to swarm the city. But she appeared at a high window. She and her two serving women, seeing Antony dying below, lowered down strong ropes and bandages. The guards below tied the ropes around Antony's body. And then, in one of the most tragic and surreal scenes in history, the three women from the top of the tomb began to hoist the 200-pound, dying, armored general up the stone wall. Plutarch says Cleopatra strained with all her strength, her face contorted, pulling him up, hand over hand. Finally, they dragged his body through the window. They laid him on a couch. He was covered in blood, pale and dying. She tore her own robes, beating her chest in traditional mourning, trying to stop the bleeding. He reached for her and he told her not to grieve. He told her she had been a glorious partner. And he told her not to trust anyone in Octavian's camp, except perhaps one man, Proculius. Then Mark Antony, the man who had been Caesar's general, the triumvir of Rome, and the man who had abandoned the world for her, died in her arms. Antony was dead. Cleopatra lay on the floor of her tomb, covered in his blood, her grief so profound that she collapsed into a fever. Octavian, now the master of Alexandria, had a final, crucial objective. He had won the war, he had won the world, but he had not yet won his prize. He needed Cleopatra alive. A Roman triumph, the grand parade of victory through the streets of Rome, was the pinnacle of a general's career. And to make this triumph the greatest in history, he needed the one thing his adopted father, Julius Caesar, had failed to get, the Queen of Egypt. He wanted to parade her through the Forum in golden chains, to show the Roman people in the flesh the foreign sorceress he had defeated. Her public humiliation was the final act of his propaganda war. He sent his men to the mausoleum. His main concern was that she would kill herself, or just as bad, that she would set fire to the vast Ptolemaic treasure she was guarding. He needed her, and he needed that gold. He first sent the very man Antony had trusted, Proculius. He came to the massive, sealed doors of the tomb. He spoke to Cleopatra through the gates, offering her reasonable terms, assuring her that Octavian was merciful and that she and her children would be treated with honor. Cleopatra spoke back, her voice weak. She refused to open the door. She would negotiate, she said, but only if Octavian would guarantee her kingdom for her children, especially for Caesarion. This was all a distraction. While Proculius was talking to her at the door, 2 other Roman soldiers with a ladder had quietly scaled the back of the mausoleum. They found the same high window through which Antony's body had been hoisted. They climbed inside and dropped down into the tomb. Cleopatra's handmaidens, Iras and Charmian, screamed. The queen, realizing she was trapped, immediately grabbed a small dagger she had hidden in her robes and lunged to stab herself in the heart. But Proculius and his men were too fast. They burst in through the front doors, which the soldiers inside had now unbarred. He grabbed her, disarmed her, and shook her. "You will not wrong yourself, and you will not wrong Caesar," he said, taking the dagger from her. His men searched her, shaking out her robes, ensuring she had no other weapons and no poison. She was a prisoner. They moved her from the tomb, which was now being stripped of its treasure, and placed her under heavy guard in her own royal palace. She was deeply ill, suffering from her fever, her self-inflicted wounds from her mourning, and profound, bottomless grief. A few days later, Octavian came to see her. This was the first and only time the 2 great rivals would ever meet. The scene was not what he expected. There was no goddess. There was no queen in golden robes. He found a 39-year-old woman, ravaged by sickness and despair. She was lying on a simple pallet on the floor, her hair matted, her robes torn, her face swollen from weeping. But even now, she was not entirely defeated. She tried one last time to use the tools that had served her so well. When he entered, she threw herself at his feet. She tried to plead, to flatter, to negotiate. She showed him letters that his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, had written to her, to remind him of their old family connection. Octavian was not Antony, a man of passion. And he was not Caesar, a man who, at 52, had been charmed by a 21-year-old. He was a 32-year-old man of cold, reptilian calm. He had just won the entire world. He was immune. He sat impassive. He did not look at the letters. He is said to have stared at the floor, never once meeting her eyes as she spoke. He coldly corrected her, refuting her arguments. He assured her in a flat, monotone voice that her life was in no danger, that she should be of good cheer, and that she would be treated honorably. He was not there to negotiate. He was there to inspect his prize. He left her. Cleopatra, the greatest political mind of her age, knew she had failed. His cold reassurance was more terrifying than any threat. He had not given her a single promise. Her last hope was gone, or so she thought. A few days later, she received a secret message. It came from a young Roman officer who had taken pity on her. He told her the unvarnished truth. Octavian's mercy was a lie. He had no intention of letting her children rule. He was, in fact, shipping her and her children to Rome. They were to set sail in 3 days. This was the information she needed. The choice she had been offered was a choice between public abject humiliation in a cage or a private, dignified death. Octavian had made the mistake of leaving her alive for those 3 days. He had given her just enough time to plan her final act of defiance. He wanted to control her body, to use her as a symbol of his victory. She would now use her own death to deny him that prize. The negotiation was over. Her final choice was made. Cleopatra began to move with calm, cold precision. She was no longer a grieving widow. She was a pharaoh preparing for her final sacred ritual. She knew she was being watched. Every move was monitored by Roman guards. She began her plan with a masterful piece of misdirection. She sent a request to Octavian, asking for one last permission, to be allowed to visit Antony's tomb and pour libations. Octavian, seeing this as a harmless act of a grieving woman, granted it. This was his first mistake. By letting her perform this act, he was reinforcing her narrative, not his. She was not his prisoner. She was a wife, mourning her husband. After her visit, she returned to her palace chambers. Her demeanor seemed to change. She appeared resigned. She ordered her servants to draw a luxurious bath for her. Then she ordered a magnificent feast to be prepared, the finest her kitchens could provide. The Roman guards, who had been on high alert, began to relax. This was not the behavior of a woman about to commit a desperate act. This looked like a woman resigning herself to her fate, perhaps even preparing for her long voyage to Rome. The feast was served, and with it, a simple farmer reportedly arrived, carrying a basket of beautiful, fresh figs, which he presented to the queen. The guards, as was their duty, inspected the basket. They found nothing but figs and charmed let the man pass. Cleopatra sealed her chambers, ordering that she not be disturbed. With her, as always, were her two devoted handmaidens, Iras and Charmian. She had one last piece of business. She had, in all likelihood, already sent her eldest son, Caesarion, into hiding. He was the 17-year-old King of Kings, the true threat to Octavian. He was smuggled out of Alexandria, sent south toward Ethiopia, with the desperate futile hope that he might somehow escape. Now she wrote one final letter. It was not a plea. It was a command. It was addressed to Octavian. In it, she formally requested that her body be buried in the same tomb as the body of Mark Antony. She handed this sealed letter to a messenger, with instructions to deliver it directly to Octavian. This was her true genius. The letter was her timer. It was the signal. She knew that the moment Octavian read it, he would understand what she was doing, and he would send his men running. She was now in a race against time, a race she herself had started. As the messenger departed, she began her final act. Hidden beneath the figs in that basket was, according to legend, an ASP. This was not a small viper. This was an Egyptian cobra, the uraeus, the most sacred and symbolic creature in all of Egypt. This is the key to her death. She was not just killing herself with poison. She was performing a final, divine, royal rite. The cobra was not a symbol of suicide. It was the symbol of the pharaohs. It was the serpent that coiled on the crown of the king, the protector of the sun god Ra. Its bite was not just venom. It was a divine kiss, a transferal of the monarch from the mortal world to the realm of the gods. She had studied poisons. She knew which were fast and which were agonizing. She chose the cobra not for its speed. It can be a painful, paralyzing death, but for its meaning. She was dying as a god. She was dying as the living incarnation of Isis. She was dying as a pharaoh of Egypt. She would not be a prisoner. Sometime later, her letter reached Octavian. He ripped it open and read her request. The trap was sprung. He understood instantly what was happening, and that he had been outplayed. He was furious. He dispatched his guards at a full run to the palace. The guards broke down the sealed chamber doors. But they were too late. The room was quiet. The feast was untouched. There, on her golden couch, lay Cleopatra. She was not in robes of mourning. She was dressed in her full, formal, royal regalia as the goddess Isis. She was dead. Her handmaiden, Iras, lay dead at her feet. Her other handmaiden, Charmian, was swaying, visibly dying, but still on her feet. With her last ounce of strength, she was, as Plutarch describes, carefully adjusting the royal diadem on her dead queen's head. One of the first guards to burst in, aghast, shouted at her, "Was this well done, Charmian?" Charmian, before she, too, collapsed and died, whispered the epitaph for her queen, and for an entire age. "It is well done," she said, "and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings." Octavian was robbed. He had won the world, but she had won the final personal battle. He had her body, but he did not have his captive. In death, she had escaped him, controlled her own narrative, and died, not as his prisoner, but as the last pharaoh of Egypt. Octavian, in a cold fury, was denied his ultimate prize. He had conquered her kingdom, but she had conquered him in death. Yet, perhaps out of a calculated respect for his rival, or perhaps because it simply didn't matter anymore, he granted her final wish. He buried her with full royal honors, side by side with Mark Antony in the mausoleum she had built for them. Then, he began the clinical, ruthless task of cleaning up. His most immediate and dangerous problem was Cleopatra's eldest son, the 17-year-old Caesarion. This was the boy who had been proclaimed King of Kings, the boy whose very existence was a direct threat to Octavian's legitimacy. As the adopted son of Caesar, Octavian could not tolerate the existence of the biological son. Caesarion, who had been sent south toward Ethiopia, was intercepted. Octavian's advisors, according to one historian, debated what to do, until one of them, Arius, reportedly quoted a line from Homer, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." Octavian agreed. He lured the boy back to Alexandria with false promises of safety and kingship. As soon as Caesarion was in his grasp, Octavian had him summarily executed. The true son of Julius Caesar was strangled. His dynastic threat erased forever. With her eldest son dead, Cleopatra's other three children, the children of Mark Antony, were a different matter. They were not a threat to Octavian's name. They were simply the orphans of his defeated rival, and they were very young. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were 6. The youngest boy, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was just 2. They were, however, still valuable as trophies. Octavian seized them, and later that year, when he held his magnificent triumph in Rome, the children were the star attraction. They were forced to march in golden chains through the streets of Rome, paraded before the cheering crowds as symbols of their mother's defeated kingdom, alongside an effigy of Cleopatra herself, being bitten by the asp. It was the ultimate humiliation she had died to avoid. Her children were forced to endure it for her. After the parade, the fate of orphans like these was usually grim. They would be quietly murdered or sold into slavery. But Octavian, now secure in his power and renaming himself Augustus, chose a path of calculated mercy. He handed the 3 orphans over to the one person in Rome who had every reason to hate them, his own sister Octavia. This was Octavia, the virtuous Roman wife whom Mark Antony had divorced for Cleopatra. In an act of staggering nobility and kindness, Octavia, who was already raising her own children by Antony, took in Cleopatra's children as well. She raised them in her own household, alongside their half-siblings, and gave them a full, noble Roman education. The 2 boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, did not live long. They disappear from the historical record, and it is almost certain they died of illness in their teenage years, a common fate in the ancient world. But the girl, the daughter, Cleopatra Selene, survived. And she, like her mother, was a queen in waiting. She had her mother's intelligence and her family's resilience. When she came of age, Augustus used her, as he used all noble children, for a political alliance. He married her to another client king, Juba II, the brilliant Roman-educated ruler of Numidia. Augustus then gave the new royal couple a new kingdom, Mauritania, in modern-day Morocco and Algeria. And so, Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene, became one of the most powerful and successful queens of her time. She and her husband, Juba, ruled Mauritania for decades as loyal, prosperous allies of Rome. They built a magnificent new capital, Caesarea, named in honor of Augustus, and they modeled it after the city she had lost, Alexandria. They built a great library, a lighthouse, and monuments. She named her own son Ptolemy, keeping her mother's dynasty alive for one more generation. Through her, the bloodline of Cleopatra and Mark Antony did not die. It continued, flowing down through the royal families of the Roman world, a quiet, surviving thread of a dynasty that had otherwise been completely extinguished. Octavian returned to Rome. He was now, in all but name, the first emperor. He had no rivals. He had a united Senate, a loyal army, and most importantly, he now possessed the entire treasury and the entire grain supply of Egypt. Egypt, which had been ruled by pharaohs for 3,000 years, and by Cleopatra's Greek dynasty for 300, was no longer a kingdom. It was now a Roman province. But it was not a normal province. It was the personal, private property of Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, and his successors. The age of the pharaohs was over forever. The death of Cleopatra was more than just the death of a queen. It was the end of an entire age. Her death marked the final, definitive end of the Hellenistic period, the world that had been born 300 years earlier, when Alexander the Great had conquered the globe. Cleopatra was the last active, independent ruler from any of Alexander's successor dynasties. With her, that entire chapter of history closed. The Roman Republic, too, was dead, killed by the very civil wars she had been a part of. The Mediterranean world was now unified under a single master, a single empire, and a single emperor, Augustus. Her defeat, and Octavian's victory, was the birth of the Roman Empire. Her true legacy was buried under the propaganda of her enemy. Octavian's poets and historians created a myth that would last 2,000 years. The myth of the seductive, exotic, and dangerous foreign queen. It was the story that served him. But her real story, the one we have told, is of a different woman. She was not the passion-driven lover of the legends. She was a cold, calculating, and brilliant politician, forged in a family of traitors and murderers. She was a linguist, a naval commander, a logistician, and a financial genius. She was ruthless, capable of ordering the execution of her own siblings to secure her power. And she was charismatic, capable of raising armies from nothing and commanding the loyalty of the most powerful men on earth. She was the only Ptolemy in 300 years who bothered to speak the language of her own people. She was a ruler who, through sheer force of will, intellect, and daring, took a bankrupt, failing puppet state and turned it, for a brief time, into the heart of a new empire. She played the great game of power at the highest possible level. She gambled against Rome, and she lost. In the world she lived in, there was no prize for second place. The story we remember is the one written by the victor. But her true story is that of a genius. A woman who looked at the crumbling world of her ancestors, stared down the greatest military power in history, and for 2 decades refused to be a pawn. She chose at every step to be a queen. She was the last true pharaoh of Egypt.